here in a moment if you guys want to find seats. Thank you. Hello, good evening. My name is Nico Lustig. I am a third-year law student in the JD and Masters for Food and Agriculture program here. And I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Food and Ag Law Society. And our student group is interested in digging deeper into the issues of law and policy sprouting from food and agriculture. And tonight is one of those prime examples of an area of law that we are deeply interested in examining and learning from experts to find ways to make farmland succession and transfer and new farmland access available for all. As our student group, we look at all aspects of the food system, and we work to help students link with opportunities to work in food and ag policy with farmers and farm service providers, with food producers and food system policy makers here in New England, throughout the country and the world. Tonight, we're focused on the issues of farmland succession planning, and one of the reasons why is that one of the projects as students that we've worked on through the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems has been the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit, which some information is available on one of the tables here. But before we begin with the content of the evening, I'd like to take a moment to recognize all the amazing people that worked hard to bring this event to you. Would the student members of the Food and Ag Law Society please stand up? Thank you. Our students are what makes this group wonderful and great to work with. They are farmers and food producers. They're interested in a wide variety of food and agriculture issues coming from all over the country and the world. They're involved in classes that specifically focus on food and agriculture policy, and they work with the great faculty and staff at Vermont Law School to engage in these projects, especially through the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems and the Food and Agriculture Clinic. And would the staff and faculty members of our Center for Ag and Food Systems please stand up? Thank you. So specifically, I want to thank the event planning committee. Courtney Safran put on, with the help of Tori Helwig, this fabulous food spread using a lot of local food items. So please, during the evening, partake. For Lauren and Ben, who helped with the marketing of the event, and for Vicki, who's helped coordinate the CLE credit. So for all the Vermont attorneys in the room, please work with Vicki to sign up and get credit for tonight. And then for Bill and Emily for helping with the computer and IT stuff to make sure things run smoothly, and Buildings and Grounds for setting up the room itself. And I want to give a very special thank you to one of our master's students, Allie Burlow, who made this all possible and helped envision this event and invite our special guests. So, Allie, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Dean Lori Beiranavand, the director of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. Dean Beiranavand is a master educator involved in teaching us the intricacies of food and agriculture, law and policy. She's one of the authors of the Blueprint for a National Food Strategy. Lori, along with other faculty members and staff of the Center for Ag and Food System, are a daily inspiration and continued source of information about this innovative and evolving area of law. So thank you, and I'll have you come up.
Hi, everyone. Wow, that almost made me cry. So thank you, Nico, for the kind introduction. I also want to thank the Food and Ag Law Society. You all are a constant source of inspiration for us as teachers as well. So thank you, and thanks for putting on such an important event that addresses such an important set of issues. I also want to thank our distinguished panelists and our distinguished moderator for agreeing to moderate the panel as well. So I'm going to try to talk really quickly, but just set the stage for some of these issues, and I hope I'm not stealing the thunder of any of our panelists. But I'm sure that most of you have heard the statistics about the average age of farmers in the United States, and this data is relatively old. I think it was the most recent I was able to find, and somebody might have some better data, was from 2012. But as of 2012, the average age of farmers in the U.S. was 58 years old, with more than 31% of farmers age 65 or older. And the USDA estimates that over half of farmers are going to retire within the next decade. So while there are a number of energetic young people that want to enter this field, many of them even coming from non-farming backgrounds, there are significant barriers and hurdles for them to be able to enter this market. One in particular, and I would say in this region, or in the Northeast, it's probably even more prevalent, is the issue of access to farmland, whether it's to lease or to buy, simply because real estate and property is incredibly expensive in the Northeast. So it's incredibly expensive to begin a farming operation just by gaining access to land. For farm families that are trying to pass their farm businesses on to the next generation, succession planning has been a real challenge. Many of them don't feel confident necessarily that their succession plans are going to take effect. And many farmers don't even have an estate plan or an identified successor. So as a result, we see a very small percentage of farm businesses being transferred to the next generation, and that percentage gets even smaller as you move further on down to other generations. So tonight's panelists are going to address these complex issues in addition to others from a variety of perspectives. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor John Echeverria, who graciously agreed to moderate the panel, and in turn will introduce all of our panelists. So for those of you who don't know Professor Echeverria, he is a professor of law at Vermont Law School, where he teaches property, public law, not anymore, your bio is outdated, and a wide range of environmental and natural resource law courses. Prior to joining the faculty in 2009, he served for 12 years as the executive director of the Georgetown Environmental Law and Policy Institute at Georgetown University Law Center. He was also general counsel of the National Audubon Society and general counsel and conservation director of American Rivers, and was an associate for 4 years in the Washington, D.C. office of Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed. He's also written several books and scholarly articles on environmental and natural resources law topics, has represented state and local governments, environmental organizations, and planning groups in a variety of legal matters.
Just a moderator, come on.
In 2000, you're our distinguished moderator. In 2007, Professor Echeverria received the Jefferson Fordham Advocacy Award from the American Bar Association to recognize outstanding excellence within the area of state and local government law over a lifetime of achievement. Thank you for agreeing to moderate.
Done? So after that, you may wonder, what in the world am I doing moderating this program? I don't teach in this field, and I have very little relevant professional expertise. I think it's actually because Nico Lustig and I are members of a very small mutual admiration society, and so thank you, Nico. Although, truth be told, I do have some personal association with this issue, because several years ago, in a flight of fancy and folly, my wife and I bought a hilltop farm in the lovely town of Tunbridge that had been owned for 90 years by several generations of the Dodge family. Ran it as a very small subsistence dairy farm. The family joke was that Edgar Dodge got to keep the family farm in the family because late in life he gave up dairy farming and went into the insurance business. And apparently there was truth to that. He died, his wife lived on and died in the farm at the age of 100 without any direct heirs, meaning the farm went on the market and it sat on the market for a good deal of time until the price came to a point when my wife and I could make this ridiculous real estate move and buy the farm. The succession plan was sort of in place in a way we hadn't realized. The head of the Tunbridge Road crew wandered by, and he introduced himself. He says, "It's nice to meet you, and let's get this out of the way. I've been hunting here for years, and I want to continue to hunting. Is that all right?" And we, yes, it's okay for you to continue to hunt. The vast ski-mobile organization approached us and said, "You know, it's a long-standing tradition of running ski-mobiles on your property, and we trust you're not going to disrupt that." And we said, "No, we're not going to disrupt that." And then it turns out we also had two farmers on the property, one who ran heifers in the summer for an local organic dairy, and a cousin of his who hayed several fields. And they had been in a kind of an interesting situation because the owner of the property in the final years of her ownership was in her late 90s. Their tenure was decidedly insecure, and they invested, I would say, relatively a small amount of time and effort in keeping things up because they thought they were sort of at the tail end of their tenure. And then we came along, and we've been engaged in a process of trying to assure them that despite our somewhat advanced age, we're actually going to be around a fair amount of time, and they have a firmer assurance of tenure. But then we ourselves will face a problem of succession. So anyway, that's just my personal point of privilege. I find this topic very interesting, and I actually care about it personally. So we have three, apart from the undistinguished moderator, we have three very distinguished panelists. And I am going to introduce each of them very briefly, not at the enormous length that Dean Biraneran introduced me at. And then each will speak for 10 or 12 minutes in turn, and then we will open up the floor to discussion and questions. So our first panelist is Annette Higby, who is a local attorney who gets down into the nitty-gritty of succession planning for farm owners here in Vermont. She's had wide experience in the agricultural law field, having served as the policy director of the New England Farmers Union, as the grassroots advocacy coordinator of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and finally as the policy coordinator of the National Campaign for Sustainable Agriculture. Our second speaker is Mike Ghia, who is the Vermont Field Agent for Land for Good, a regional organization focusing on preserving agricultural lands and making them available to farmers. He is himself a part-time farmer. He works as a farm consultant through the University of Vermont Extension Service. He also works through the Vermont Farm Viability Program as a farm business planner. So he has extensive practical experience in counseling people who want to get onto the land. And then finally, our last speaker is Maria Moreira, who is the executive director and co-founder of World Farmers in Lancaster, Massachusetts. She has a very long and distinguished career in this field. She, from an early age, was herself a farmer working in the dairy business. She directed marketing for the Ethnic Crops Program and the Beginning Farmers Program at UMass for about a decade. She was served as the FSA County Committee Advisor for 9 years and has been a member of the USDA Beginning Farmers and Ranchers Advisory Committee and the Massachusetts Farm Bureau. She's also been a 4-H sponsor, a steering committee member for the Worcester Food Hub, and a board member of both NIFI and the Rural Coalition. And I won't go on because it goes on and on from there. So with that, I turn the podium over to Annette Higby. Thank you and for your indulgence.
Is it okay if I speak from?
Yes, absolutely, whatever's most comfortable.
So hi, everybody. Nice group tonight. So I'm Annette Higby. I practice law in Randolph, Vermont. I just moved my office to 2 South Main, so I'm right downtown now. So for the past 35 years or so, I've either practiced agricultural law or worked on federal farm policy. And I started out in Nebraska at the Center for Rural Affairs. And back then, practicing farm law meant doing farm debt restructurings in the late 80s. That was that decade's farm crisis, so that's what I did right out of law school, which was tough. Also working on farm policy. Moved to Vermont about 20 years ago. Did some policy work for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, for the National Campaign, for New England Farmers Union, but also continued to practice law. My practice right now, which is not full-time, is solely focused on business planning and estate planning for farm succession. So that's all I do. So even though I have a private practice, most of my work on farm succession is done in a team. It's really important to work as a team because the issues get very complicated in terms of the financial, you really can't separate the financial planning issues from the farm succession issues. So the succession plan really has to match the cash flow, and I'm sure Mike can speak to this a little better, but it's really important to have that sort of, that team of legal, financial, tax, and sometimes family kind of counseling issues. So,
Apologies for the interruption.
okay. Is that better? Did it sound like I was shouting in your ear? Sorry. Okay, so working in a team, either with Mike or somebody at the Intervale Foundation or UVM Extension, and all of that is supported generously by the Vermont Farm Viability Program, which I think is probably the, I would say, one of the best, I think, models for providing farm succession planning I've seen anywhere across the country. I also work with nonprofits. Mike's organization, Land for Good, I headed up their farm succession task force the last 3 years. In 2017, we held a continuing legal education seminar. It was a 2-day CLE. The first day was business planning entirely, and the second day was more estate planning, everything from soup to nuts. And I've worked with Kathy to take some of the CLE materials, and we've put together a compendium, and that will live on a website called the Farm Transfer Network of New England website. There's lots of resources on that website around farm succession planning and land tenure issues as well. And if there are any farmers in the audience, you can also search on that website for farm succession advisors in your area. We're hoping to do another CLE in 2017, and probably the best way to, well, I will certainly will involve VLS. So one of the primary objectives in my mind of the CLE was to try to get as many young lawyers as possible involved. And I think we had eight or nine attorneys in practice for fewer than 5 years, and I was really excited about that. And we had some mentoring sessions. Farm attorneys are aging as well, just like farmers, so it's really important that we have another generation coming along to do that kind of work. In terms of farm transfer, it's most often a glacial process, and it's also most often a two-step process, so that the entering generation, family or non-family, will take a stake in the farming operation entity as separate from the real estate, learn management skills, earn an equity stake in the business, which makes them more creditworthy to actually purchase the farm. So that's one reason why it takes so long. The other reason is that sometimes there are family issues that get in the way and other problems. In terms of, I guess one of the biggest hurdles right now, I would say in Vermont, if you look at what's happening in conventional dairy, things look pretty dim. My clients are organic, conventional, sustainable. I take my clients where I find them. And so the organic dairy folks are doing pretty well. They're able to do some succession planning. The veggie folks are doing fine. There's a whole cadre of organic veggie pioneers who are now looking for successors, and that's really interesting to see. These really successful businesses that started out as just a bunch of hippies in the 70s. So that's fun to see. There are also, there are farms that are conventional dairy that are just unable to comply with reps, if, only because of the configuration of their farms. If they've got, they're farming in an area where it just doesn't make sense, given milk prices and other issues, to invest in $800,000 in a manure storage handling process. So those cases look pretty dim too. But I also think that this current dairy crisis in Vermont is, I don't want to say an opportunity, but I do think that we're going to be seeing some big changes in terms of land use, and so that's something to keep an eye on. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Mike.
First, I want to compliment the moderator because it's definitely a good move to let the town road foreman hunt on your property if you want to get your road plowed in winter around here. So I work for Land for Good. We're a nonprofit based in Keene, New Hampshire, but we work in all 6 New England states, and I'm the Vermont field agent. And we work on anything to do with farmland access and tenure, so anything to do with farm real estate transactions, as well as people finding farms. And then we work on farm succession. We work directly one-on-one with farm seekers, with non-farming landowners who have property that they are making available to farmers or would like to make available to farmers. We work with farm families on farm succession and transfer, and we work on policy issues. Our policy person, Chris Coffin, just went back to work for American Farmland Trust, so we're restructuring how we're going to be working on policy, but we're going to continue to work in that arena. And we work on development of a lot of technical resources for both farmers and service providers. As Annette mentioned, we had her involved in our farm transfer task force that was funded through a Beginner Farmer and Rancher Development Fund grant from USDA. And as a part of that, we were able to have Annette help develop both the CLE as well as the Farm Transfer Network of New England website. In previous incarnations, we developed a bunch of resources that I put over on the table on the side related to both farm leasing and farm transfers. We've also, in the last few years, been doing research around the advent of these farmland investment companies that are coming at it with a social mission. So there's long been farmland investment companies out there of various reputations, but there are a number of companies out there that are saying that their interest is also in seeing the farmer be profitable and not just making money off of land speculation. And there's a number of companies there are 3 that are working regularly in New England, and so we did a research project around looking at how those investment companies work and whether or not the tenure situations that they were offering farmers or are offering farmers really worked in the best interest of farmers. And that research report, which is already a bit dated because these models are very quickly evolving, but still the content, and I think most of the content in there is still valid. There's a copy over there, and all of our resources they have over there are also available on our website. As Annette mentioned, in Vermont, we're lucky to have the Vermont Farm Viability Program, and it is really unique in the country in that it's a state-funded program that involves a lot of partners to deliver one-on-one services to farmers, farm families on farm transfer and succession. One thing that Land for Good was able to do last year was we were able to host through our federal funding, was to host a national farmland access and farm succession conference, and we chose to have it out in Denver, Colorado, rather here in the Northeast, so we could draw on a greater group of people, and we ended up having about 300 people from, I think it was 43 states. So we were very pleased about the dialogue that happened over those 3 days around these issues. As a result, it's increased our outreach outside of the region. We had been doing work at different points in Minnesota and Wisconsin and other places. Now one of our staff persons was just out in New Mexico helping them on farm succession. Going to that conference, and then also the National Farm Viability Conference last year, which Vermont Farm Viability helped spearhead, really see that we were further ahead than a lot of states in this country in terms of providing succession and transfer support. The program in Vermont is state funded, and then they contract with Land for Good, with University of Vermont Extension, who I also do this work for, and then I do my farm business planning work through UVM Extension's Farm Viability Program. The Intervale Center up in Burlington, NOFA, which is the Organic Farming Association, and then the Center for an Agricultural Economy up in Hardwick. And then those programs then have people like me on the ground that are working one-on-one with farmers. And we can work with these farm families for up to 2 years in the way the program has been traditionally structured. But because of the glacial nature that Annette has mentioned of farm transfers, which is a very different issue than the farm business plans. Farm business plans, people tend to jump on them. They get a lot done. 2 years makes sense for the program. Not that people don't come back to us years later and still want help, or they say, well, now I need a new business plan. But farm transfer plans can take place over decades, literally, different pieces at different points. And so we're trying to evolve in the farm viability program to recognize that. And I have people that I was working with back in 2008, 2010 that contacted me this winter and said, well, we've now gotten to this next stage we weren't ready to work on back in 2008, 2010. Now we're ready to work on this. There's not a lot of service providers out there, at least that are publicly funded, that can do that kind of work over time. And that's where Vermont is unique. We talk about this in Land for Good since we work in all 6 New England states, that we don't have that opportunity to have a program like that in the other 5 New England states. Even the Mass Farm Viability Program only offers us a chance to work with people for a couple of visits and not the extended time that Vermont's program does. And we do work in a team, as Annette said, and I feel very lucky to have been able to work with Annette with several farms over the years, and a couple more I just threw your way. And the thing that gets complicated with the farm transfers is, I think to begin with, we have to think about what we're really talking about here. Is there a business on this property, or are we just, that needs to be transferred, or are we just talking about real estate? Because there's a lot of, your approach is going to be very different if we're just talking about transferring the real estate, whether it's a sale or you're gonna will it to somebody, versus if there's a viable business or a business that's not viable, which is, as Annette was talking about, one of the greatest difficulties. The greatest difficulty in farm succession is having a business that can actually make money and stay on the land. And so you have to be very clear about what people want when they come to you about farm succession or farm transfer, because it's going to be a very different approach depending on what they're what they're really talking about and what's possible. Because if the business model that they're doing is just a business model that's not going to be able to be continued to the next generation, that has to be discussed. And sometimes the family in either generation or both generations is not willing to look at the reality of it. As an example, one of the farms I just threw to Annette is a conventional dairy where just I've looked at the financials of it. I want to support these small conventional dairies, but I'm looking at this one and how far downhill the infrastructure has gone, the lack of reinvestment. They've been shoveling manure all summer because they broke the manure chain and they can't afford the $4,000 to get the manure chain fixed for the gutter cleaner. And there is no more borrowing capacity. Looking at the milk prices next year, I gave them a projection that, this year they're going to lose $43,000. Next year they're going to lose $68,000. There are 2 members of the family that are ready to get out of dairy. This farm has very good soils. They could be doing something much more profitable. But it's the person in the younger generation that does not want to give up dairy. And that is going to be one of the most difficult things that is going to make or break whether this is going to succeed or not. Right now, the younger generation's in denial about the fact that there is no equity left. She, well, not on paper, but within the family, owns about half the herd. This was never legally put in paper anywhere. But the fact of the matter is that they owe more than the herd is worth. So she's concerned about getting her equity, and I keep telling her there is no equity right now. If you guys sold these cows, you would still be in debt. And so I'm trying, but looking at what we could do there, this farm could turn around if they were willing to change the business model. There are family tensions in this family, and that's another issue that Annette brought up that we're dealing with a lot. And so I've had both, we have a program here in Vermont called Farm First, where we can get professional family counselors. I've had them involved. I've now got ag mediation involved because they have to mediate with their creditors. We are having an accountant involved. We are having the land trust involved because one of the possibilities to move forward is to sell the development rights. You only pull that trick once, though, so you have to do it carefully. One perpetuity is a long time. But these are the kinds of things that we have to work through, and it's not ever one person that can do it. And so I'll just wrap up at this point by just noting, just really emphasizing that point, particularly thinking about it if those of you that are going to go into the legal arena, because I've seen cases where lawyers just start doing paperwork for people when there's not a real clear picture about what's going to happen with the business. They're setting up LLCs before it's time, before they understand whether the business can continue, before it's clear who's going to be owners in the business. They're putting trust documents together when they're not really, there hasn't been a full discussion about who's going to be involved there. Is things going to be split equally between all the children, non-farming and farming, which is a big problem we can talk about tonight? Or is it going to be split equitably, where the person who stayed with the farm might have a bigger share of the estate, and the non-farming heirs may have much less because they didn't stay with the farm? And so, they're putting together, I walked in where lawyers are already starting these documents before any of these other bigger discussions have happened. And it can really just spend a lot of the farmers' money that sometimes they don't have when they really need to start making some of these other decisions before they ever see a lawyer. And I always tell the farmers, it's often a chicken and egg thing. We go, we look at business stuff, we go and we talk to the lender, and the lender says, well, this will fly or it won't fly. We go to talk to the lawyer, and they say, well, this could work or it couldn't work. We go to the accountant, and then you have to go back and forth to each of these until you figure out what is going to make everything work from the legal standpoint, the tax standpoint, making the lender happy, because if there's low notes, they have to go along with it. and as well as making the family happy. And that can be definitely one of the biggest challenges.
I'm gonna stand. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so my name is Maria Moreira, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of World Farmers in Lancaster, Massachusetts. A little bit of a background. I'm an immigrant. I'm a farmer, former cheesemaker, and now the executive director. I began dairy. I'm a former dairy farmer, so it's very painful actually to hear the issues about dairy farming because I've gone through that firsthand. I dealt with it a little bit differently, but being an immigrant, I think it was good and bad, but I'll talk about that later. I began in 1982, but I also in 1984, I began to work with immigrants and refugees at that time with the Hmong in 1984. And then I did the value-added thing in 1986 because of the dairy industry. I had too much milk, and I couldn't feed my 4 children. And I couldn't go to work, so I was in that, what do I do, what do I do? I gotta feed them. And I didn't wanna go into credit card debt. So, long story in between, in 2010, I co-founded World Farmers with my dear friend, Ali Burlow. And in 2018, we have over 300 farmers on a parcel of land of 70 acres. So World Farmers advocates and supports small immigrant farmers, both at the markets, both at US and internationally. The Flatsmento farm is where all of these farmers farm. And this is they're very, very small. So a lot of our farmers are subsistence farmers. So they grow for themselves, because when they come to this country, they really want to eat their food that's familiar to them. So in a lot of the times, it's just they mentally they need to grow their own food, you know. And then as time passes, they grow for their family, their friends, and in the markets, and and so on. So at the Flatsmento Farm, which is a program of World Farmers, we afford them that opportunity. Just the map of the 70 acres. And on the Google one, on your left, literally shows how we have, the biggest one is 4 acres, and they go to 6 farmers markets, and it is sustainable with 6 farmers markets because they produce all ethnic high value food, and also the crops that they grow. It used to be 15 years ago that no one ate pea tendrils in Brookline, Massachusetts, but now it's the in thing.
Where is Lancaster in relation to?
Lancaster, Bolton, Harvard, Fitchburg, Leominster, and that area.
So like an hour and a half west of Boston?
An hour. 1 hour. And who are the farmers? They come from Southeast Asia, Africa, and in the Caribbean as well. So land. In 2018, we had our first, World Farmers has its own 12-acre piece of land. And this happened because a gentleman whose land was in the family for generations, Tom Burgoyne, he's the middle right behind me. He really, really wanted to support small farmers. And by the way, the tillable land is only 3 acres. But it's so important, so really important to have, for the farmers, for the program to own the land. And it's not only real, but it's a real addition to the program, but also more symbolic that the farmers really feel like it's theirs. Okay, the success, during the past, we've been around for over 30 years, 35 years. So access to, the successes, we have access to 70 acres that the Flaxmantor Farm is housed. We purchased the 12 acres just this past year, and that was because a benefactor held our mortgage. And also 1,200 farmers have gone through our program. That means they've moved away, a lot of them moved away to California, Missouri, North and South Carolina, to where land is less expensive than in Massachusetts, unavailable in Massachusetts. The challenges. What are the challenges that we face on land access? We have the inability to add more landowners who are willing to lease their land to immigrant and refugee farmers for a myriad of reasons. And also, this organization has, I think it's a failure and a challenge that we haven't been able to access public lands because for lots of reasons, we just haven't been able to be at the cusp of access, especially things like fish and wildlife, land trusts, and because there's a lot of barriers to get immigrant and refugees into the land. Policies that work, 61A, partnering with agencies that lease fish and wildlife. One of the things that would actually work is instead of having the large tracts of land, over 100 acres, to us, 10 acres would be great. And to put those large tracts of land into smaller pieces so that land could be allocated in a much more equitable way with, existing farmers, farmers that have been farming for generations, along with the new incoming farmers. Land trusts, right to farm ordinances, city staff positions support access to land and agriculture purposes, and the inclusion of farmers on our local boards, and including the new faces that are our farmers, will be our farmers of the future. So I'm just going to go through the pictures, and this is why I continue doing this work. Farmers in our program, they are farmers because they all come from agrarian backgrounds. So they're not gardeners. So we also work with an organization in our area for those people who say, I just want to garden, and we partner with them. If you want to garden, that's who you go to. But with us, it's serious farming. Because these farmers, they grow for their family, their community, and then once they get over the family and community, then they start selling. I'm just going to go through them quickly so that way I don't go over my time. So, VU has been with us for over 15 years, and by the way, our program doesn't graduate anybody out. People graduate out themselves because life happens to people, and we don't adhere to a very strict, we don't throw anybody out because it doesn't fit our system. We're there to serve farmers, period, and to serve the community. And so the farmer will evolve him or herself out. And that's what's happened. We don't push anybody out, but people do leave because they go to better places. Or sometimes they just don't farm anymore, or they move away for other reasons. Ghia is a Somali Bantu refugee whose family fled to Kenya when she was young. In Kenya, she would help her mother with crops that the family ate. Over the past 2 years, she has become a successful farmer. She sells crops at the farmers markets and is creating homemade food for the community. And Rokia, she's really vivacious, and she has, actually, she's been, Ally interviewed her for her radio program. She's a sweetheart and a great marketer. She's a great marketer. This is Veronica, and this is a crop that's extremely popular extremely popular with the Kisii tribes in Kenya. So, huge market for this crop. This is Fabiola. Fabiola participates in USDA programs that's part of what we do as well. We assist farmers participate, we connect the farmers to USDA programs. This is Oliver, that's his high tunnel. And Oliver is actually an engineer by trade. So, loves to farm and does a great job at farming. That's it.
Thank you. So if I may, I have a question for those with a particular focus on Vermont. One of the tactics that Vermont has embraced is the so-called OPAV, which is an option to purchase at agricultural value. And the basic idea is to buy, using public dollars, not only the development rights, but the any value that the land may have above its value for agricultural production. Typically what happens is the holder of the easement has the right to regain ownership of the farm at its agricultural production value if necessary. And this is regarded as a way of putting a cap, more or less in perpetuity, on the value of the land, and to prevent the tender mercies of the free market to operate and run up the value of the land and ensure that the land will be available on an ongoing basis and on an affordable basis for farmers. I'm just curious what your experience with OPAV has been, whether you think it's a good tool, what problems it may present.
Well, from a policy standpoint, I think it's a great tool. I guess I would push back a little bit on the notion that it caps the value of the land. So if, under the OPAV, if a farmer wants to sell to another farmer, the easement holder doesn't have a right to, step in and purchase it at ag value. So that doesn't mean that the farmer purchasing it has to pay ag value. They can pay more than ag value if they want it that badly. So it does, so it's difficult for beginning farmers to compete with other farmers to purchase an OPAV farm. So if they sell it to a farm, if the conserved landowner sells the farm to another farmer, then the easement holder does not have the right to step in and buy it at its agricultural value. If they can sell it to a neighboring farm who is willing to pay more than agricultural value, they can do that. And beginning farmers really have to, compete with more established farmers who can pay more for that land. But it doesn't really cap the value to agriculture use value. That said,
Just so I understand,
Yeah.
but if you wanted to sell it to somebody who was moving up, retiring from New York City, then at that point, the land trust or the Housing and Conservation Board could step in and take ownership of the property.
They do.
It's only if it's resold
Right.
to a farmer who's going to farm it.
Right. So in that sense, I think it's not a perfect tool, but I think it's a great tool to ensure that conserved land stays in the hands of farmers. I'm just saying that there's still can be this bidding war. That's all. And it's also, I think, land conservation in the context of farm succession. An OPAV will actually pay more than a regular easement, so that makes it a little easier, sort of greases the skids for the new farmer to. It also, if the land trust wants to exercise that option, frequently the Vermont Land Trust will buy property and
Well, they'll buy property ahead of putting an easement on it.
yeah,
They haven't
right.
acted on the OPAV more than maybe twice, I think.
Yeah, so it's it's an option. It's a trigger that they can use. But generally, I think it's a great tool.
I would generally concur with that. I was on a conserved farm back in the 1990s before the OPAVs were put into place, and Massachusetts was the first state that originated this, and you know, the farm that I was on had already appreciated quite a bit since its conservation, and it was going to be very hard for my wife and I to consider buying it, and ultimately was sold at a more of an estate price, and we'll get into that story later on. So I was actually on I was part of the focus groups that they did to decide whether to bring the OPAV to Vermont, and I went to a hearing in White River before I was on the focus group, and there were 60 people in the room, and I was one of only 2 people that was advocating for the OPAV. Generally, it is considered a good tool, but there are problems with it, as Annette pointed out. And to kind of explain a little bit more, when you look at where agricultural value is determined, it's determined by an appraiser using comparable sales. So when you have different appraisal methods, you can use comparable sales, or you can use replacement cost minus depreciation, which doesn't really apply to land, and then you can use an income method. They don't, so in other words, looking at the income potential as you would an apartment building or a shopping mall, and they never use that in the Northeast. Now, I think you told me once, Annette, that in the Midwest, the appraisers will sometimes consider the...
Yeah, they'll do both, and then they'll just sort of meld them together. But, you know, in the Midwest, it was sort of everything's corn and soybeans, and you know what the income is, and it's...
Right. And that's the argument for not using the income method here in the Northeast, so use comparable sales. One of the problems with comparable sales is you have no idea when you're looking at those comps what the economics of the farmer who made those purchases were. Did they have a family inheritance that allowed them to do it? Are they a more established farmer that had a lot of equity? There's been a problem in the Connecticut Valley with one farm that has a lot of equity, paying very high values for conserved land at this point, and unconserved land, because they are in an equity position to do that, which a beginner farmer would not be in. And so you're not necessarily getting at the nuances. You're not looking and saying, well, this corn ground could generate this amount of income, and therefore the ag value, that's not how they're coming up with ag value. They're not saying, well, this is vegetable ground, and a farmer could afford, based on some sort of standard, affordability of housing is 30% of your gross, no more than 30% of your gross income should go to housing. And if you're paying more than that, it's no longer affordable housing. We don't have an exact standard for that on affordability of farmland. There is no formal business definition of what the affordability of farmland is, and so it will differ with different business models. If you take a river bottom soil around here that's in corn silage for a conventional dairy, even if you swap that to organic dairy, you're going to change the economics of it. You change it to vegetables, and you're going to change it tremendously. So that same soil, that same piece of land, for each farmer is going to have a different value. It would make sense if we were looking at that and seeing what the business can afford to pay, and establishing agricultural value that way, but that's not how we're doing it. And as Annette says, some farmers, if they really want this land, they have, so for instance, you have this established farmer, they maybe inherited their original farm, and then they bought up more farms, they added more cows, more equipment, and they've paid a lot of that debt down. They're in a good equity position, and they're looking at their debt across all their acres, including the acres they've already paid off. They're looking at their debt per cow. So they're looking across it, and it still works for them, even though there may be, when you looked at, if there were particularly the dairy farmers that are doing this and using it to grow corn silage, and you look at that value of corn silage, maybe $1,200 a year in income versus, and what they're paying per acre for that land. If you were looking at it from an income standpoint, you wouldn't come up with that being ag value. And that's one of the limitations. One of the other things too is we're looking at, there's a big difference in how Vermont and Massachusetts have set up their OPAVs. There's not a lot of other states that have adopted this yet, though Rhode Island is about to set up something, and they're similar. And there are not statewide policies, but in the Hudson Valley of New York and in parts of Maine, they're also applying this. They've applied the same concept in some farms in conservation in New Hampshire, but New Hampshire as a state has been opposed to it. And you look in each of these, depending on how you implement it, could be different. In Massachusetts, they're running into problems because all farms, any type of farm transfer, the state will have a say in it. And they started to get involved too heavily in sales that they should never have gotten involved because they were farmer-to-farmer sales that were fine. And now it's become a problem in the legislature, where the legislature this last winter was trying to change the OPAV or even eliminate the OPAV. There were certain people there because there's so much tension in the ag community right now about the way the OPAV is actually being implemented. And so there's,
Well, I really opened a can of worms, I didn't.
yeah.
So that was a complicated subject.
Something that we've been-
Seminar on that topic at Vermont Law School, having to use
But it is, one of the things, even though the land trust has not had to act on it, I think more than twice, they have found it to be a deterrent.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're doing at Land for Good is,
deterrent against, constrains price.
well, deterrent to being sold to non-farmers. And one of the things that we've been doing at Land for Good the last few years, we've are now able to offer continuing ed credits to real estate agents. And so we've been doing some real estate agent trainings. And the first place we did it was in the Champlain Valley, which is heavy with both farms and conservation easements, because one of the panelists that I bring on there is from the land trust, and the land trust had run into issues where real estate agents did not understand the OPAV, and they did not understand that they had an obligation once the contract was signed to bring the contract to the easement holders, and then they weren't even reading the OPAV and understanding it, and so there were contracts being signed with non-farmers. And then when the real estate agents found out that this sale was not going to go through, they were livid. And because the land trust was saying, look, you can, technically what they could have done was then act on their option and actually purchase the property. And instead they said, look, if you make this contract go away, we won't act on the option, and then the farmer will still have their choice of who they want to sell to. And that's what's happened. And it's amazing when some of the farmers have signed on to this that they haven't explained it. They've got a farm with an OPAV. They should know what that means. But
And the
a lot of them
farmer
don't.
loses a sale.
They lose. There have been a number of cases where they did lose a sale to a non-farm buyer. There's also this issue, and part of what's come up in Massachusetts was when you have a beginner farmer who doesn't qualify as a farmer, and so the state of Massachusetts is saying, well, should we allow this sale to go through? And there was one case where I know they didn't believe the business plan of the farmer buyer, that these young farmers that were starting up, and so they wouldn't let the sale go through. And that's not what's happening here in Vermont. Vermont, in fact, has been saying, we're going to waive our right to the option. If we've got a farmer who's got farm experience, not just somebody who walked off Wall Street, says they want to be a farmer, but somebody who's been working for farmers, has been working with people like me on a business plan, and maybe even leasing, generally leasing for a few years, because it's the better way to get the business started than buying real estate too early in the business, that they're going to waive the OPAV and let the sale go through. Because the definition for the farmer in the OPAV is that they're making more than 50% of their gross income from farming. And so some of these farmers, particularly when the business is young and they may have somebody who has a good salary off farm, it doesn't quite work, but they've got the plan to build it up from there. They're letting it go through.
Well, thank you for all, that's fascinating to me, at least. Other questions, comments?
Any legal challenges to citing solar on agricultural land that you can come by, and especially in succession with these 20-year contracts?
No, I haven't.
Well, this is something that been working on, I might be the antagonist here, because I've been working on trying to have the state have a sensible policy around solar siting on ag land, because it is taking land out of production, particularly prime agricultural soils, and the policy up until the bill that was passed in 2017 basically did not take agricultural soils into account whatsoever. And now it's at least supposed to be taken into, it's at least supposed to be taken into account in the process. And they've changed the structure of the payments so that there are preferred sites, so former gravel pits, landfills, parking lots, rooftops, those are preferred sites. You get paid what they call an adder, so you get more money if you put your, for the payment on per kilowatt hour, if you put the solar panels on a preferred site. If it's a non-preferred site, which includes agricultural soils and forests, you're not going to get that. So now there's a little economic incentive there. But both the state of Vermont, with the current use property tax program, and the Land Trust Vermont and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board now have policies about allowing when solar is allowed on these properties. And basically, it's around the primary use of these solar projects being used for farm use, as opposed to selling off the farm.
Hi, good evening. Thank you to all of you for being here this evening. I have a question for Ms. Moreira. I am really fascinated by the structure of World Farmers. I am from Minnesota myself. I grew up on a small hobby farm that's located right next to the Hmong American Farmers Association. So I've been really interested in these kinds of refugee resettlement farmers opportunities. I'm curious about how long you tend to work with any given farmer who comes to work with World Farmers who's looking for land. How long I know you said that there's no graduation time, but I'm wondering about how long a single farmer tends to, on average, work with your organization, and also whether you help connect farmers to other opportunities to access land that's off-site from World Farmers for people who are looking for more permanent opportunities to access land.
I'll start with answering the last first. We're actually, we just received a beginning farmer grant that is taking our farmers to the phase 4, which literally is going to focus on working with, to move farmers off the site, because first of all, we don't have any more room. And since we don't turn anybody away, we also, by the way, do no outreach whatsoever, and it's all word of mouth. But we're busting out at the seams. So we're going to focus, we're actually going to be working with the Land for Good to try to see if we can find land and move, actually kind of edge. We don't push anybody out, but we're gonna kind of encourage. But the thing is that they have to, that they have to have another piece of land. And being who they are, it's extremely difficult to find land. And as far as the program, we don't, up to this day, we haven't pushed or graduated anybody out. We've had people there for 15 years, but and 18 years. What's really, really amazing is the evolutionary process that couldn't have happened otherwise. We also, just this past year, I've seen this, the young person, the son of the original farmer took over, and now he's actually looking for, he says, I've got to get out of here, so he's purchasing equipment, and he'll be our first success of, leaving the farm. We always strongly encourage, we provide access to USDA programs, and we also do what we can to find other landowners, but extremely, extremely difficult. There's a lot of issues with liability, and not knowing exactly how to structure the lease. I think there's a lot of fear that people that have 4, 5, 6 acres, 10 acres, ooh, what if I can't what if I can't have it back, or, and before, what we need to come up with is something that we can take to the landowner before, they say no. Because we get a no before we can even, get in the door. So I hopefully to work with other organizations and to formulate some sort of process that will, that we can work with.
Thank you.
Other interventions?
Pick one.
They're all worthy.
Hi, I'm Ben. Thank you again so much for being here. This has been a really great panel. My question was, I guess, sort of for all of the panel, but also for Annette. You mentioned something about, these hippie farmers just getting together and starting a farm way back in the day. And I was wondering if you had any insights on what the new generation of farmers looks like, the people that are ready to take over to succeed with this farmland.
Sure, Mike will probably have something to say about this too, but there was a study, I don't know if it was 3, 4, 5 years ago, USDA really looked at beginning farmers, and they were kind of overwhelmingly organic. They were less likely to participate in federal farm programs, not this, or I would say commodity programs. And that's what I see too in my practice. And so lots of the beginning farmers that I see are on lease land, so I work with them on leases, try to, provide as secure tenure as possible. The current use statute in Vermont requires if the landowner is not farming it themselves, they need to have a 3-year lease, so that helps a lot. There's a little bit of leverage. But when I first started out, I just would, these beginning farmers would come in and they'd show me these lease templates that were just horrid. It was like, if you miss a payment, I get your firstborn. It was just really bad. So I think I worked with Mike on this. So we just did there's this publication online, the Business of Farming in Vermont, the legal guide to the business, and we just put these templates out there, and lawyers and farmers, they're all picking them up. It's just sort of like gone viral. So I'm really pleased about that. So, and Land for Good has done a lot of work on it.
So to answer your question, it's one comment I'll make for sure is that it's important to not conflate beginner farmers with young farmers, because they're not necessarily the same thing. And some of the research that we've done recently says a lot of the beginner farmers here in New England are midlife career changers. Sometimes that could be good. They can come in with some equity and some money. Sometimes they come in, though, without any farm experience and very naive notions about what the farm will be like. And, with some of my friends, we joke about how what we should have done was write a book about how we came to New England and failed farming, because that seems to be the way that things happen. There's these books of people who had this midlife crisis and came to farming and didn't know what they were doing and haphazardly went through, and they make a lot of money selling books. So, and there's a lot of them who want to come to Vermont in particular. And but some of them do know what they're doing, or are humble enough to learn about that. But there's still a fair amount of young farmers that are a mixture of people that are very pragmatic, some of whom grew up on farms. I just came from a farm on the other side of the mountains where the daughter came back. I think, particular to the succession issue, that's one thing that I often caution farm families about. When they ask me to come in to work with them on farm transfer, and they say, well, none of the kids are interested in the business. And I ask, well, how old are they? And they're like, well, they're 26, 27. A generation ago, that might have been, that would have been some of those hippies that came up and started. I said, that's not the demographic these days. I says, first of all, you got to talk to your kids and not just assume because they're not here at the farm right now that they don't want to come back. And there have been a few that we have had those conversations and they did come back. But it's much more common these days that these young farmers that grew up on the farms, they go out, they say, I'm leaving the farm, even if the farm is successful. They go out, they get a college degree in something that's not agricultural, they go off and they do something else, they get a good career, they don't get married until they're around 30, they don't start having kids until their early 30s, and they say, where do I want to raise my kids? And is this the career that I want to be doing while I'm raising kids, that I'm never home? At least my parents were home. So I see much more that the next generation, so the farm I was at today over in the Champlain Valley, I have been talking to this farmer, very successful organic vegetable farmer, for about 6 or 7 years about, you should really be thinking about transfer. He's like, yeah, we know, we're ready to step down, and we just don't know what to do. And you don't think either of their daughters are interested. And it was like, he got in contact with me a year ago and said, I was driving my daughter from somewhere, and she told me she wanted to come back to the farm. I almost drove off the road. And she's 29, I was like, well, there you go. It's about the right time. And she dropped her career and is coming back, and now we're working on it. And there's an example where she grew up on the farm, but she still needs to develop management skills because she didn't do that. She just did whatever mom and dad told her to do. And now she's going to take over this business. She needs to learn how to be a manager. So we have those, and then we have, people that find farming in college and decide they want to do it. They start working for farms and they work their way up. There's really a diversity and an increasing diversity with the amount of immigrant farmers as well. There's an immigrant farm program up in the Burlington area in Vermont. And I think there's more opportunity there, I think, to help develop those people that's not fully tapped yet.
Other questions here?
Thank you all for being here. I saw reference in the slideshow to a right to farming or right to farm ordinance. I was wondering if anybody could comment on what those look like and what kind of results are being seen in places where they're being implemented.
Okay, so, generally, a right to farm ordinance will protect a farming operation from a nuisance suit. And it usually requires that the person who wants to sue or bring a nuisance suit, if they actually came to the nuisance, then it bars their suit. Is that? Yeah, and I don't know. I have not looked at Vermont's right to farm statute for a very long time, so maybe there's somebody in the audience who has looked at it lately who might have something to say about it.
Not one of the stronger ones,
Yeah,
I believe.
I'll just say, in general, from in Nebraska, when these massive hog factories came in, the people who were suing were neighboring farmers. They weren't city folks who were, coming to the nuisance. They just, so it's, they're very controversial.
I think some of them in some of the states also forbid municipalities from zoning against farms as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Something that's been alluded to is the Vermont's current use program. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what your thoughts are on that and any improvements that could be made to that program.
I'll let you go there.
You'll let me go there?
Okay. So, it's useful in terms of keeping land open. It's also useful in the sense that it requires a 3-year lease if you're, if the landowner isn't farming. I do think also that it can be used by non-farmers who come up to Vermont and decide to put a couple of beef cattle out on pasture. So, you know, it's a lot like the OPAV tool. It's not perfect, but in terms of the farmers, working farmers' bottom line, it's really important, as well as forestry. So, and it's also very controversial. It just seems to get amended by the legislature every single session. So there's.
Or they try, it gets brought up.
Yeah. So it's.
I mean, the basic idea is that instead of your property being taxed at its market value, it's taxed at its agricultural value. And to my understanding, and the experts will correct me, is sort of the genius of the program is that you would think that having land in current use would be of great concern to the local jurisdiction because their tax revenues would decline dramatically. But they don't, because the state makes the local jurisdiction whole. So the bill for the current use program is sent to Montpelier. It's not felt locally. And I think the state pays $50–60 million a year.
I'm not sure, but I do know that, you know, keeping the land open is certainly a lot cheaper than for the local municipality than development would be in terms of. But just as an anecdote, I just worked on a case where a group of very wealthy landowners, second homes, were concerned because their farmer was retiring, so they're looking for a new farmer. And just one landowner was saving like $15,000 a year on real estate taxes, just, you know, from haying and grazing. And so it's, you know, it can be a subsidy in the wrong direction sometimes, but on balance, I think it's really useful. So.
The Vermont, well, when we were doing the landowner's guide to leasing your land for farming, which is over there, it's a New England-wide publication. I worked up the section on current use programs, and so I looked at the current use programs in all 6 New England states, and they're all very different. And I caution real estate agents that have licenses in Vermont and New Hampshire to make sure, you would think that they'd understand this, but they come to my class and it's very clear that they don't. And that they're very different in how they're structured. You know, 61A, which Maria mentioned in Massachusetts, is you know, an example where, you know, if you take your land out of current use, you have to pay a penalty, and how the states structure those penalties is different in each state. She mentioned 61A in Massachusetts, which is the agricultural land, and 61B is forestry, and then 61C is a public or a recreation land designation. And if you change designations within that in Massachusetts, you don't pay a penalty. Well, you can actually change 61A to a golf course 61C, and I believe you don't pay a penalty because it's recreational land. It's not been developed into housing, and that would be you know, we don't have anything like that. We don't even have that designation here, and so each of them, you know, have different things that are better and that are worse about them. Vermont has a 25-acre minimum to be in the program, where New Hampshire only has 10. And sometimes I wonder, well, why do we have 25? Does it matter? Rhode Island doesn't even have a minimum acreage.
Well, it's a little roady. It's a small state. You know that.
Right. Yes, constantly teasing our Rhode Island field agent about Rhode Island being the metric for measuring things in the United States. So how many Rhode Islands can fit in that? You know, Vermont has a plus in that we are the only program in New England where farmers who make people who make more than 50% of their gross income from farming, designated farmer, does not pay any property tax on the agricultural buildings. And that's a big savings here in Vermont. They don't have that elsewhere. Like, for instance, New Hampshire, they even tax the footprint of the barn. So they tax the land that's underneath the barn, which the other states don't generally do. But in Vermont, they're not even taxing the building. Or if you're leasing the farm buildings to a farmer who is somebody who's legally considered a farmer, that property owner will not pay any property taxes on the buildings. And that's a big savings that can, and it could be an incentive for a non-farming landowner to lease the building to the farmer.
Yes, hi. Thank you all for being here and for the work that you do. My question is about healthy soils legislation and programs and the regenerative agriculture bill that's been proposed in Vermont and one in Massachusetts. I'm wondering what your comments and thoughts are, both from the policy perspective and your interaction with farmers on that type of legislation.
I'm not familiar with it, I'm sorry to say.
I've always danced on the periphery of it as well. It seemed like a well-intentioned goal, but it really couldn't, I was having difficulty seeing how it was going to be implemented, and so honestly, I haven't paid that much attention to it.
Okay.
Well, I have.
You could tell us what you
Yeah,
think.
could you tell us? Because I'd be interested. So is it, well, go ahead, just summarize.
I hesitated to ask this question because I feared I might have to talk a bit more. Mike, you had mentioned in your example of the small conventional dairy farm, the conversation with the youngest of the family who wants to keep it dairy, when you mentioned there's really good soil there, and there could be a lot of profit made if something else was grown. So that made me wonder, what is the resistance to that? Is it cultural and really kind of honoring the tradition, or is there something else that would be helpful for farmers who do want to grow something else but can't put up the upfront costs, for example, to transition to a different form of farming?
Well, this case, it definitely is cultural and personal for that farmer. It's not actually the youngest generation, it's the middle generation. They're older than I am, and that's one of the things that she's holding on to, is because her parents are 91 and she owns none of this. Her parents own all of it, and it is why Annette and I got our work cut out for her, because we don't know how much time we have here to wrangle this around. And so she's like, I've never, I'm 60 and I've never had control here. And it's about control. Her parents controlled the checkbook, and that was it for her. But she also sees herself as a dairy farmer. She wouldn't even consider organic dairying, which is not an option right now because the markets are completely closed. And meanwhile, both her children that would have been involved in the conversation have said, we won't come back to the farm if it is a dairy. And so the youngest generation is involved. And but as far as financing to move to a different crop, well, there are options out there, and I think I'm not sure if the regenerative ag bill would generate something specific that would help them in that direction. But it's not necessarily wouldn't necessarily be the only option. I think if we have a good plan here, I think that they would be able to get financing to change to other crops, even with the massive amount of debt. That's the big thing, because if we sold the cows, we think we know. If they sold the cows, I think we know what they're going to get for them now, which is half of what they thought they would get, or what they were worth 2 years ago. But it still would be enough. They sell feed and some other things. We could clear out enough debt that if they could keep working on the other debt, they could transition to something else.
Thanks.
I'm sort of interested in this. We talk about farming and we're talking about land ownership or rights in land, and it's and this panel presents us sort of a variety of perspectives on that relationship. Annette is talking about succession in the sense of transferring ownership of the farm to the next generation, so the next generation is the farmer, and that's sort of a traditional model of farming operation. But in Maria's universe, you're dealing with farmers who have, I guess, very thin legal rights to be on your property or the organization's property. You know, you never kick them off, but I bet they don't have a long-term lease either. And it's sort of an informal arrangement that works. And so it just strikes me that there's a very broad range of possibilities in terms of the kinds of legal arrangements and informal arrangements that farmers can have to acquire a secure expectation to be able to work the land.
Yeah, but secure is the word. And when a farmer moves off and really now gets a loan and has a business plan, he needs some sort of security, a longer-term security on the land. You don't have to own land, but you have to have some sort of secure land acquisition so that you can implement your business plan. You can implement your business. It doesn't have to be a big, you can make a living in less than 10 acres in our markets because we have such a diversity of crops and they're niche crops, high value. But you still need that lease that will hold them to their business.
But the farmers you work with have that security, although they have nothing in writing.
Yeah, because you have a landowner who they know would never put, because that landowner has a social conscience. So the problem is what we're trying to do is make sure that we identify, either other landowners with a social conscience but so that landowner passes away and the family comes in. If there's not a legal document to the right to that land, even this present land, it's been a conversation at the Flatsmenter Farm. What happens when the landowner passes? And what's in place? Nothing is in place at this moment, but there's a conversation in the works that will hold the present system, even though the original landowner passes, so that farmers do have the same, that the program continues, because the children could say, gee, I think, we don't want this here anymore.
I guess I just wonder if there's sort of a legal niche out there that's waiting to be filled, where you're dealing with landowners who are not nonprofits and don't have a conscience as a sort of a matter of organizational mission, but are good-hearted, but private individuals who would like to make a long-term commitment to farming, and farmers would like a long-term commitment from them. But I'm just not aware of a lot of models out there for long-term private leases of agricultural land in Vermont. Maybe they're out there.
Farms will often have a dual legal structure so that the farming operation is in an entity, usually an LLC, and the LLC will lease land from the landowner, and oftentimes that's just held in fee simple by the founding generation. So the transfer happens in a gradual pace. So you first start transferring farm operating assets. The land, for lots of reasons, often is the last to transfer, usually at the second death. And that has to do with the tax basis rules. So if they make this gift inter vivos, then they take their parents' basis. If it transfers at death, they get a step up in basis, which is, so that's one reason. The other reason is that if there are non-farming heirs involved, people have to sort of figure out who's going to get the farm and how does that all work out. So that takes a little while. In terms of sort of a long-term lease structure, I think those templates that I mentioned rarely had, that I first started seeing, rarely had a binding on heirs and assigns clause. If the landowner died, then the lease pretty much terminated. So my leases always have a binding on heirs and assigns clause. Just so that if something happens, the heirs can't throw the folks off the property. Let's see, Equity Trust has some other kind of long-term lease models where the farmer has a long-term ground lease, a 99-year lease. They own their improvements. There are some restrictions on sale of those improvements. They try to keep them affordable to the next farmer. So there's that model out there. And it also, I mean, you can do that, not necessarily, quite often it's done, a land trust will, enter into the ground lease, but you can also do it as a private landowner. Cooperative land ownership, I think, also has some potential in terms of making land more affordable. If you've got a group of farmers who are willing to farm together, and they're sort of at this, there be some synergies between their operations, that's a potential. So there's lots of models.
So about a third of all the farmland in the United States is leased. And that number has fluctuated some, but it's generally stayed around a third, though in some places you can get around 50% of ag land being leased. And so ag leasing is really, really an important part of this. And even you just talked about your own property. When you bought there, there's 2 tenants that you inherited there, and they were very concerned about continuing, and they didn't have that written lease with that clause that Annette talked about, and that's something that we've been working on. Land for Good is making sure that people, when they're getting their leases together,
They don't have a lease now, and I don't know any of our neighbors who have such lease arrangements.
well, see, and that's something that we've been working on Land for Good, because that is so common. That is the most probably common lease situation, especially for pastures and such, is just a handshake agreement. And they got lucky because you were amenable to them coming back in, but they obviously were concerned, which is why they showed up. And so we're trying to impart to landowners that they should consider written leases with the farmers for various reasons, and including just accountability on each party, and also just making sure there's a clear understanding of what the expectations are between each party, because we're often also dealing with tension between landlords and tenants that come when there's unmet expectations or miscommunications because things were not done in writing. And so we're working a lot on lease agreements, and particularly also trying to help farm or non-farming landowners to understand what some of the needs are of the farmer in terms of the leases. So for instance, if they're going to get a loan for equipment or cattle or greenhouses, those generally are going to be on a 5 to 7 year loan payment term. And so very often the lender will say, we cannot lend to you if you've only got a year-to-year lease, because we don't know if you get thrown off next year, how are you going to continue to pay the loan until it's done? And so we're trying to get people to work more with these intermediate term lease terms of 5 to 7 years. And to go beyond that for a lot of property owners is difficult, because they don't want to have their hands tied. If they need to sell the property, want to sell the property. One of the things that I've been talking more about in Vermont is that we work with the farmers on their succession plans, but we have these non-farming landowners like yourself who don't have succession plans for their land. And so many of these farmers, particularly dairy farmers, might lease a third, or they might own the home farm but still lease 30 to 50% of their land. And sometimes they're like, well, I actually lease 10% more land than I want, because I know at some point I'm going to lose some of it. And that only works for so long. And I'd rather see them on secure leases. So we work on a transfer plan within that farm. But if they're reliant on this leased land where there's not a success, where there's also older landowners and there's no succession plans there, they could easily lose significant parts of their land base. It may not be the most important. It may not have any of the important infrastructure on it because it's the part that they own, but it's still really important. But because some property owners don't want to have themselves tied up for long periods of time, what I've worked with Annette on, in some cases, are these rolling leases where they might be a 5-year or 7-year term, but they have an automatic renewal clause every year. So it just keeps pushing the date out another year. And that becomes important when farmers are trying to plan infrastructure in the middle of it. So I had one farmer that I worked on with this who was leasing land and needed to put it 3 years into the lease, needed to put an irrigation system in, and it was going to be a 5-year payback. Well, they're 3 years into a 5-year lease, so she wasn't going to want to do it unless that lease term could be extended. So the rolling lease would help address that. So it's not just the initial loan, but also, farm businesses evolve and their needs change, and you start having to make decisions whether it involves a loan or not. Do I want to invest in this new piece of infrastructure when I've only got 2 years left in the lease and I don't know if it's going to be renewed or not? So trying to do something like a rolling lease where you always kind of know, well, yeah, I can always look 5 years out and I know I've got a lease for that amount of time. I can depreciate it over 5 years, pay off the loan in 5 years, or whatever the financial parameter they want to assess it on, and say, it's worth the risk. If I have to walk away and leave it, I leave it. Though in some cases, property owners will invest. We've worked out where property owners will invest in the infrastructure, or they will be willing to pay for the undepreciated value of infrastructure that farmers put in if the lease ends before they depreciate it. The most common one seems to be a well. So the farmer needs more water. They get a well drilled. They put it on a 10-year depreciation schedule because they know they're going to be there for 10 years. Oh, something happens. They leave at year 7, and the property owner is willing to pay them the last 3 years depreciation on that well. So the farmer, can walk away. The property owner has a well that they didn't have before.
Yes, so thank you all again for your time and the good work that you're doing. I wanted to ask a question about farm viability projects. Annette and Mike, you both mentioned that you work with the Vermont Farm Viability Project and that it's a really great program for connecting farmers with business and legal specialists, and it puts funding behind that as well. And that there are other states that have, some states have similar programs, but they aren't as strong as the Vermont program. And I wondered if you could just reflect a bit on what makes the Vermont Farm Viability Project so unique and what challenges there are to other states setting up similar types of programs. Is it purely funding and political will, or are there other challenges as well?
Well, I think sometimes the expectation is that all this work would be done through extension, through the university extension system, but a lot of those extension systems are being gutted. So there are still some good programs out there where they are doing work. There are people in Nebraska and Iowa that are doing direct work with farmers on succession planning that have that as designated an extension. But overall, there's just generally not a lack of understanding in a lot of these states that there's a need for this and a willingness to put up funding for it. The Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which funds and administers the Vermont Farm Viability Program, has been trying to change that dynamic and been working together with a coalition of service providers throughout the U.S. There's something blueprint that they're working on that's trying to get funding in the Farm Bill to provide more of these types of programs throughout the United States, and also do professional development. University of New Hampshire had one extension business person who also did farm succession stuff. And when Mike Scarbarazzi retired over a year ago, they posted the job 3 times and they got no viable candidates. There's not a lot of people being trained in that area. So I think one of the things that makes our program unique, back to that part of it, is I think the extent of the amount of time we can spend with people, at least over the 2 years that they're enrolled in the program. There isn't, sometimes the extension people can take a call here and there, but there isn't a lot of programs out there where somebody can really focus and keep people focused. We're going to do a Transfer the Farm workshop for farmers this winter. UVM Extension had been doing it until Bob Parsons passed away last February. And always a very good workshop. It's where I've done some of my professional development and always learn a lot. And farmers always come away feeling really good about that going to these transfer farm workshops, but if you pull them a year later, and we've done some of this, and you ask them, did you get something out of the workshop? Yes. Did you do anything? No. Because they need somebody to move it along. And the farm I was at today was a perfect example. It was just like, yeah, there was all this stuff that we didn't do that you asked us to do, but we started doing it today because we knew you were coming. You know, and then now the growing season's winding down. It's a vegetable farm. It's, you know, and they're like more committed to getting their homework done. But, you know, that's the thing is a lot of people are getting this stuff done because they know one of us in the program is going to come and ask them, did you do your homework? So
I think viability grew out of the recognition that we were putting a lot of resources into land conservation, but not very much into sustaining our farms and to ensuring economic viability. And I think one of the things that they did early on, which makes it so successful, is that it didn't all go to extension. So some of the contracts went to NOFA, some of the contracts went to the Intervale, UVM extension, so that there's a lot of diversity within agriculture in Vermont. So there was some place where, however you felt, if you were organic or if you were sustainable or if you were conventional, you felt comfortable going. And I think that was really, really important.
I think we've exhausted the subject, so thank you very, very much.
I see yawning.
Well, the audience has stuck with it, so thank you to the audience for being so attentive.